this is Jean Gann with Big Wand, and I'm here today with Congressman Rob Wittman from the 1st District. Congressman Wittman, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Great to be with you.
Thank you, thank you. It's good to be here.
Yes.
As we've been talking to many people here today up on the Hill, the big topic these days is the government shutdown.
Yes.
And how it's impacting the people in your district, which I understand is predominantly military. Is that correct?
Yes, we have quite a significant military presence in the 1st Congressional District. We have about 114,000 veterans. We have about 30,000 active duty military personnel, and then over 40,000 federal government employees. Many of them are retired military that are working for DOD on the civilian side. So a tremendous impact on our district with this shutdown.
What are you hearing from your constituents?
Well, people are concerned. They're concerned about a variety of things. They're concerned about the size and scope of government. They want it to be open. They want us to be making decisions here. Many folks, though, are also concerned about the Affordable Care Act and what that means. I've heard from businesses and individuals deeply concerned about that. In fact, I was just on the phone today with a businesswoman who was concerned about what it will mean for her business, and she still doesn't have clear answers. So I think people want us to continue to work on the Affordable Care Act and make sure that it is indeed a piece of legislation that works. And the way it's constructed right now, it doesn't work. And we see all the different problems out there for people. And while we all want to make sure that people can purchase insurance regardless of pre-existing condition, what we find is that the costs of health care continue to go up, the cost of insurance go up, and if you cannot afford insurance, or if your out-of-pocket expenses go up because of deductibles and because of co-payments, then what you find is a situation where this is actually making things worse for people rather than making things better. If you can now purchase insurance regardless of pre-existing condition, but you can't afford to purchase it, then that's as bad as not being able to purchase it because of that pre-existing condition. So we really have to work hard on this, and a lot of people out there are very, very concerned about Obamacare as well as myself, and I want to make sure they're working at that. At the same time, keeping government open. We have an obligation to keep the operations of government open, especially in my district, the military. It's one of our constitutional responsibilities to provide for the defense of this nation. We have an obligation to do that, and we must make sure that we continue the operations of the government, especially in those critical areas like our military, the FBI, Drug Enforcement Agency, the Veterans Administration. All of these things are extraordinarily important to our nation, but also important in the 1st Congressional District.
And so how are things going? I understand the House has offered several bills about funding veterans, military, the NIH. Are we seeing any success in the Senate with this? Or?
Well, unfortunately, the Senate hasn't moved on many of those bills. They did move on the Pay Our Military Act, so many of our DOD civilian employees, Department of Defense civilian employees, have come back to work, which is a good thing. We are also going through and funding the other elements of government, which I think is a responsible thing to do. Unfortunately, the Senate's not acting on that, so they have an opportunity to reopen those areas of government. They have chosen not to, which I think is not the right thing to do. They ought to be acting on that to continue the conversation with where we need to go as a nation concerning our debt. I'm very concerned about the depth of the debt that we're moving into, the size of the deficits, and that we need to address that in the long term. And we need to have conversations. Harry Reid and President Obama need to be willing to come to the table and talk. We will not get to where we need to be as a nation without addressing this deficit. It is unsustainable. And addressing this debt. We're now at $17 trillion of debt. That by any measure is unsustainable. So we have to stand strong and make sure we push the conversations to the table concerning the deficit and the debt, and that we make sure the discussion about the debt ceiling is about reducing spending equal to what we would borrow. I use the analogy of a child. If you give them a credit card and they run the credit card up to the limit, you don't give them another credit card. You get them to pay off what they have existing on that credit card, and then whatever room they might have there, then they can borrow more. We have to do the same thing, I think, in managing our debt. I think everybody looks at it and says, you know, managing this deficit and debt is job one. And we hear that just a few years ago, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, said the greatest threat to our national security is our national debt. So we need to be taking that on, as well as making sure we provide for this nation's military. It's about making sure we make responsible priority decisions about what to fund and then manage the dollars that we have. We have a long ways to go to get there, and we here in the House, need fight that fight to assure there's responsibility in how we structure government with its spending and with the size and scope of government. We can't be all things to all people. The size and scope of government is much too large to be sustainable. So we have to pare that back and size and scope our government in the way that we can afford. Not what we would like to have, but what we need. And that need goes back to those basic constitutional responsibilities.
So, in the last day or so, they've been talking about raising the debt ceiling again. Are you in favor of keeping it where it's at, or?
Well, I want to make sure, I'm very suspect about raising the debt ceiling if we are not going to make any kind of real efforts to reduce spending. As you know, the last time we allowed the debt ceiling to be increased was the Budget Control Act of 2012, the sequester, where we made these decisions to put automatic cuts in place if the Congress didn't make decisions to put those cuts elsewhere. And what it did was to say we're going to allow $1.2 trillion to be borrowed, but we're going to reduce spending by $1.2 trillion. I think you need to have the same dollar for dollar reduction in spending with any effort that takes place now with the debt ceiling increase. Because if not, then you're continuing to add to the debt. And if we continue to add to the debt, then we get to a point where we cannot pay that off in any reasonable period of time. And then it also interferes with, I think, the other economic prospects this nation faces as far as growing the economy. And I don't want that to happen. As you know, the more money government borrows, the less is available for the private sector. So that starts to crowd out the private sector. So we have to be very thoughtful about what we're doing with our deficit and our debt. And I want to make sure we're not increasing deficits. We ought to be decreasing deficits on the way to a balanced budget, which I want to get to as quickly as possible. In fact, I'm a co-sponsor of a bill that says we ought to have a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget. I think that's past due time. We ought to be doing that, but in the meantime, I'd like to get that, but in the meantime, we ought to make sure that we are reducing those deficits and reducing the rate of growth of the debt. Remember, the only way you can stop the growth in the debt is to get to a balanced budget, but if we can at least decrease how quickly the debt's growing, I think we can get to where we need to be. But that needs to happen, at a fairly fast pace. I mean, we've seen a lot of models out there that say it takes years, 20 years plus to get to a balanced budget. I think we need to be doing it in much, much less time than that. And that's our job here with this debt ceiling, is to make sure we address that.
Okay. How has the shutdown affected your district? A lot of your district encompasses the Chesapeake Bay.
It does. Obviously, with all the veterans, all the active duty military personnel, all of the government employees, all of the contractors in the district, it's had a significant effect. It's affected people's lives. We get, hundreds of calls here a day from people deeply concerned about how this affects them. Some very compelling stories about families that are worried about, how they're going to make their car payment, how they're going to pay the mortgage, how they're going to buy groceries, because for them, their pay is cut off. They're not going to work. So some good news in that our Department of Defense employees return to work, but still many other employees in other areas of government have not returned to work. So for them, it's a significant impact. So I'm very thoughtful about the impacts it has on their life and making sure that we're doing all we can to get government reopened, but also make sure that we address areas that other people are also very interested in, like the Affordable Care Act, like managing the deficit, managing the debt, making sure that we are making good decisions about our fiscal longevity and making good decisions about what are we going to do with Obamacare. It is in its current form, it is not working at all. And my concern is what it will mean for people and what it will mean for their personal lives. Not only would they be affected by potentially the shutdown, but then being affected by increased premiums, increased co-payments, increased deductibles is a significant impact. So we see that. And then, in our district, there's secondary effects because the people that live here that are military folks or veterans or government employees, all spend money too, and the businesses in the area rely on those folks in spending their money for those businesses to remain open. So we hear quite a bit from the businesses out there that are affected by the DOD folks, the Department of Defense, civilians, our military men and women in uniform, our government employees. There's a ripple effect throughout the district. So it's a significant impact, and people are very worried. And just, they want us to get the work of the nation done. I hear from folks on a daily basis. They say, Rob, you all need to get the work of the nation done. those things we agree upon and working on getting those things done.
That's wonderful. Does this have any impact on our defense?
Well, it does. I chair the Readiness Subcommittee on House Armed Services, and both the sequester, those previous automatic budget cuts, as well as this shutdown of government, has had an effect on our military. Even though today many of our Department of Defense civilian employees have come back to work, not all of them have, and we know that there is an impact on this nation's military. There's an impact on our readiness, that is our ability as a nation to meet the threats that we may face, and those are very simple terms. We're supposed to train, man, and equip our armed forces. So you have to make sure that you have the personnel there, that you train them properly, that you equip them properly. That's where the priorities are supposed to be. The problem is if you don't have the dollars going into those accounts, or they are short, then our soldiers don't get the training they need, our Marines, our airmen, our sailors, and when they don't, they're not as prepared if they're called in to go to combat. And then if they're not properly equipped, they also don't have the wherewithal to be successful on the battlefield. And that means increased risk. And increased risk at the end of the day means that when our young men and women are called to defend this nation, more will die on the battlefield. And by any measure, that is absolutely unacceptable. So we have an obligation to make sure that we man, train, and equip a force that's capable of defending this nation. With these cuts and the track that we're on, we're quickly getting to a point where it will be very, very tough for us to do that. Now, if those men and women are called to battle, they will go. But we've seen historically where if they're called to go to battle and they're not properly trained and equipped, the outcome is not a good outcome. And I know that the folks in this nation do not want that to happen. We've seen that happen in the past. We saw Task Force Smith in the Korean War, and I urge folks to go read about the impact of that when a nation was not prepared to go into an action when our men and women were called. So we need to learn from those past experiences and make sure we never let that happen again. My concern is that if we don't address that with the funding that goes to the military, and I want to make sure we're efficient. What a lot of people don't realize is we've already reduced defense budgets by over $700 billion. And if you reduce by another $500 billion over the next 10 years, the impact will be significant. So we just can't go there. We have to do things smartly, and we have to support the great men and women that serve this nation in uniform.
That's great. Well, thank you very much,
Sure.
Congressman Wittman, for
Thank
taking
you.
the time
Glad
to
to
talk
do it.
with us today and to be so fluent
Yeah.
in laying this all out for us.
Well, thank you.
We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming by. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, same here.
Thank